Russia didn't just offer weapons, they offered something far more dangerous to the West: the blueprint to break free. When Niger signed agreements to build arms factories on African soil, Paris went silent. Not because it approved, but because it knew what this meant. For 60 years, France controlled the Sahel by controlling one thing: access. Access to weapons, access to resources, access to sovereignty itself. Now that control is gone. 3 nations expelled Western forces, aligned with Moscow, and did what the post-colonial order was designed to prevent. They chose for themselves. And France's economy is already feeling it. The decision was already made. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger didn't just ask the West to leave. They forced them out. After decades of French military presence, billions in Western aid, and American intelligence operations embedded across the Sahel, 3 governments did what few African states have dared to do in the post-colonial era. They severed the relationship entirely. No negotiations, no gradual transition, a full strategic break. And the question now isn't whether this was bold. It's whether it was calculated, reckless, or the only option left. For over 60 years, France maintained a grip on its former colonies that went far beyond diplomacy. Military bases in Niamey, N'Djamena, and Bamako weren't just symbolic. They were operational command centers. Paris didn't just advise on security policy, it controlled it. The weapons these countries could buy, the alliances they could form, the threats they were allowed to prioritize, all of it required French approval. Washington operated similarly, pouring resources into counter-terrorism while ensuring that no Sahelian military grew strong enough to act independently. The result was a region trapped in a cycle, dependent on foreign forces to fight insurgencies that those same forces never fully intended to eliminate. This wasn't oversight. It was architecture. As long as Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger remained reliant on external security guarantees, they couldn't challenge the broader system that kept them economically subordinate. French companies retained control over uranium mines in Niger. American contractors managed intelligence infrastructure. And every time a new jihadist faction emerged, it became another justification for Western boots on the ground. Sovereignty in this model was rhetorical. Real power was outsourced. But something shifted. It wasn't a single coup or election. It was a sequence of military takeovers driven by officers who had spent years watching their own governments defer to foreign priorities. In Mali, frustration boiled over in 2020 when Colonel Assimi Goïta ousted a president who had relied on French forces even as attacks on Malian soldiers intensified. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré rose to power in 2022 after his predecessor failed to halt massacres in the north. In Niger, General Abdourahmane Tiani justified his 2023 coup by pointing to a government he claimed had abandoned national defense in favor of Western appeasement. These weren't ideological revolutions, they were security revolts. And once in power, all 3 governments made the same strategic choice: expel French troops, limit American operations, and seek alternatives. Russia offered private military contractors. Turkey provided drones with no political conditions. China extended infrastructure deals that didn't require democratic reforms. The West responded with sanctions, aid freezes, and warnings about instability. But for the juntas now running Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, instability was already the status quo. They weren't gambling with peace. They were rejecting a system that had never delivered it. This is where the stakes become clear. If these 3 states succeed in stabilizing without Western military backing, it undermines 60 years of assumptions about African security dependence. If they fail, it becomes a cautionary tale that reinforces the narrative of inevitable chaos without external intervention. But success and failure here aren't binary. Even if terrorism persists, even if governance remains authoritarian, the mere fact that these governments are operating outside the old framework is a geopolitical shift. Other states are watching. Senegal recently asked France to close its bases. Chad renegotiated its military agreements. The model is spreading. What happens next could redefine the region. Because this isn't just about 3 countries. It's about whether the post-colonial security order in Africa can be dismantled without collapse. The West insists that without its presence, the Sahel will descend further into violence. The juntas argue that violence persisted precisely because of that presence. And the answer won't come from speeches or summits. It will come from what happens on the ground in the next 2 years. Whether Russian mercenaries prove more effective than French battalions, whether Turkish drones shift the battlefield calculus, whether sovereignty, real, uncompromised sovereignty, can coexist with security, or whether breaking from the West was only the first step in a far more dangerous reckoning. Russia didn't just offer military support. It offered something the West never would: unconditional access to weapons production on African soil. In 2024, Moscow signed agreements with Niger to build arms manufacturing facilities inside the country, a move that fundamentally alters the security equation in the Sahel. This wasn't about selling rifles or deploying advisors. This was about transferring industrial capacity. For the first time in decades, a Sahelian state would have the infrastructure to produce its own ammunition, armored vehicles, and potentially more. And that changes everything. For years, France and the United States controlled the Sahel's military capabilities by controlling the supply chain. African governments could request equipment, but approvals came with conditions: human rights certifications, political reforms, alignment with Western counterterrorism priorities. Even when weapons were delivered, they arrived in limited quantities, often outdated, and always dependent on foreign maintenance contracts. The message was clear: you can have security, but only on our terms. Russia's model is the opposite: no parliamentary debates, no conditionality clauses, just capacity delivered. The Niger agreement is the most visible example, but it's not isolated. Russia has expanded energy partnerships across the region, particularly in uranium development, a sector France dominated for over half a century. Niger is one of the world's top uranium producers, and for decades, French companies extracted the material at rates that enriched Paris far more than Niamey. Russian state firms are now positioning themselves as alternatives, offering joint ventures that promise greater revenue shares and fewer political strings. Whether those promises hold is another question, but the fact that they're on the table at all represents a strategic opening that didn't exist 5 years ago. This is where the stakes become clear. Russia isn't replacing Western influence out of charity. It's filling a vacuum created by frustration. When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger expelled French forces, they didn't gain immediate security. They gained autonomy. And autonomy without capacity is just isolation. Russia recognized that gap and moved in with exactly what these governments needed most: weapons, training, and the perception of respect. Moscow doesn't lecture about democracy or governance. It offers deals, and it delivers quickly. The military dimension is the most urgent. Russian private military contractors, widely understood to be Wagner Group operatives and their successors, have been operating in Mali since 2021 and have expanded into Burkina Faso and Niger. These aren't peacekeepers. They're combat units embedded with local forces, conducting counterinsurgency operations that Western militaries either wouldn't or couldn't execute under their own rules of engagement. The results have been mixed: some tactical successes, significant civilian casualties, and accusations of human rights abuses. But for the juntas in power, effectiveness is measured differently. They're not optimizing for international approval. They're optimizing for survival. And that's the logic driving the arms production agreements. If Niger can manufacture its own ammunition, it no longer needs to negotiate with Paris or Washington every time its stockpiles run low. If Burkina Faso can repair its own armored vehicles, it isn't grounded when foreign contractors pull out. This is strategic autonomy in the most literal sense: control over the tools of state power. It's also a direct challenge to the post-colonial order, where African militaries were intentionally kept dependent. But there's a cost. Russia's model may lack political conditions, but it's not free. Energy deals come with long-term contracts that lock in Russian access to resources. Arms manufacturing facilities require Russian engineers, Russian blueprints, and Russian supply chains for key components. The dependency doesn't disappear, it just shifts. The question is whether Moscow's version of influence will be more tolerable than Paris's, or whether the Sahel is trading one patron for another without fundamentally changing the structure. What happens next could redefine the region's alignment for a generation. If Russia successfully establishes arms production in Niger, other African states will take notice. If the partnership stabilizes the Sahel without triggering broader conflict, it becomes a model. If it collapses into deeper instability or exploitation, it becomes a warning. But either way, the West's monopoly on African security partnerships is over. Russia didn't wait for an invitation. It created the conditions for one. And now the Sahel is betting that Moscow's promises are more reliable than the ones that came before. 3 nations, 1 decision, and a message heard across 2 continents. Africa will choose its own allies. When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger formalized their alliance with Russia, it wasn't just a security pact, it was a declaration. Not through speeches at the United Nations or symbolic gestures at summits, but through coordinated military agreements, shared defense infrastructure, and a unified rejection of the partnerships that had defined the region for 60 years. This wasn't diplomacy, this was defiance. And the implications stretch far beyond the Sahel. The military dimension is the most immediate. Joint defense arrangements between the 3 states have created an integrated security zone spanning over 2 million square kilometers. Shared intelligence networks, coordinated counter-terrorism operations, and cross-border troop deployments mean that an attack on one is increasingly treated as an attack on all. Russia's role isn't peripheral, it's structural. Training programs, arms supplies, and private military contractors operate across all 3 countries, creating a level of defense readiness that none of these states could sustain independently under Western partnerships. The West offered support. Russia offered capability. And capability is what these governments needed most. But the significance goes deeper than hardware. Politically, this alliance represents something the post-colonial order was designed to prevent. African states coordinating their foreign policy in direct opposition to Western interests. For decades, Paris and Washington maintained influence in the Sahel by ensuring that no regional bloc could form without their approval. Bilateral agreements kept countries isolated. Competing interests kept them divided. The idea that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger would not only expel French forces simultaneously, but then build a collective security architecture with a non-Western power was unthinkable 5 years ago. It's reality now. This is where the stakes become clear. The alliance isn't just about what these 3 countries are doing. It's about what they're proving is possible. Other African states are watching. Senegal recently moved to close French military bases. Chad renegotiated its security agreements. The Central African Republic has been operating under Russian military partnership since 2018. The model is replicating. And every time another government reassesses its relationship with former colonial powers, the post-colonial security architecture weakens a little more. Symbolically, this is the part that resonates beyond policy circles. For populations across Africa, especially younger generations, the sight of Sahelian leaders standing alongside Russian officials rather than French or American diplomats carries weight. It's not about ideological alignment with Moscow. It's about the assertion of choice. The narrative that Africa must accept Western terms, Western timelines, and Western priorities in exchange for security and development is being publicly rejected. Whether that rejection leads to better outcomes is still uncertain, but the fact that it's happening at all represents a shift in how sovereignty is being defined on the continent. Russia understood this symbolism and leveraged it deliberately. Moscow positioned itself not as a replacement hegemon, but as a partner willing to respect African agency. Whether that framing is genuine or strategic theater is almost irrelevant. What matters is that it resonates. When Russian officials engage with Sahelian governments, they don't bring conditions about democratic governance or human rights benchmarks. They bring contracts. And in a region exhausted by decades of conditional aid that never translated into stability, that difference is politically powerful. But symbols don't stop insurgencies. The alliance's success will ultimately be measured by whether it delivers security, economic development, and political stability, or whether it simply replaces one form of dependency with another. Critics argue that Russia's model is extractive, that private military contractors operate with impunity, and that the lack of political conditions enables authoritarian consolidation. Supporters argue that those concerns are secondary to survival, and that no system imposed from outside has ever prioritized African interests over external ones. What happens next will determine whether this alliance becomes a turning point or a cautionary tale. If the Sahel stabilizes, if terrorism recedes, if economic sovereignty follows military autonomy, then other African states will have a blueprint for breaking free from post-colonial structures. If the region fractures, if violence escalates, if Russian influence proves as extractive as what came before, then the argument for Western partnership strengthens. But either way, the era of unquestioned external control is ending. The question isn't whether Africa will choose its own partners. It's whether those choices will lead to the future its people deserve. France is losing more than influence in Africa. It's losing the economic foundation that kept it relevant on the global stage. For decades, French access to uranium from Niger, gold from Mali, and broader resource agreements across the Sahel subsidized Paris's energy independence and industrial capacity. Now that access is being cut off, not gradually through renegotiation, but abruptly through expulsion and alliance realignment. And the economic consequences are starting to show. Energy costs are rising. Strategic resource imports are being rerouted. And for the first time in the post-colonial era, France is facing the reality that it can't simply reassert control when African governments decide to walk away. This isn't just about France. The broader Western order in Africa is being tested in ways that haven't been seen since decolonization. When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger forced out French troops and restricted American military operations, they didn't just reject partnerships. They rejected the assumption that African security requires Western oversight. And as those countries stabilize their alliance with Russia, the power balance across the continent is shifting. Other states are watching, and some are following. Senegal, Chad, and the Central African Republic have all reassessed their relationships with former colonial powers in recent years. The model of dependency is fracturing. Western officials have been increasingly vocal about the risks. Public statements from Paris and Washington frame the Sahel's pivot to Russia as destabilizing, warning of increased terrorism, human rights abuses, and authoritarian consolidation. But those warnings also reveal something deeper: panic. When you've structured your foreign policy around guaranteed access to African resources, and suddenly that access is revoked, the instinct isn't to accept the new reality. It's to create conditions for reversal. That could mean economic pressure through sanctions and aid cuts. It could mean diplomatic isolation. Or in the worst case, it could mean covert or overt intervention designed to destabilize governments that refuse to comply. This is where the stakes become clear. The Sahel's governments are preparing for that possibility. Military buildup isn't just about fighting jihadist insurgencies. It's about deterring external interference. The unity between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger creates a defensive bloc that's harder to isolate or destabilize than any single state would be. Joint defense agreements mean that pressure on one triggers responses from all three. And with Russian military support embedded in their security infrastructure, any Western attempt to intervene would risk direct confrontation with Moscow's interests. That's a different calculation than the West faced when African states operated in isolation. Public support is another factor that's often overlooked. In all three countries, anti-French sentiment runs deep, fueled by decades of perceived exploitation and military failures that left populations vulnerable to insurgent attacks. When juntas expelled French forces, they were met with mass celebrations in the streets. That popular backing gives these governments legitimacy that isn't tied to democratic elections, and it complicates any external effort to portray them as illegitimate or isolated. People in the Sahel may not trust their leaders entirely, but they trust the West even less. Russia has positioned itself as the enabler of this transformation, but it's not dictating it. Moscow didn't create the frustration with Western partnerships. It capitalized on it. By offering arms, training, and resource agreements without political conditions, Russia provided the tools these governments needed to act on existing grievances. The result is a new balance of power where African states, or at least a bloc of them, are operating outside the framework that defined the continent's international relations for over half a century. But the risks are significant. If the West perceives its losses in the Sahel as existential, economically or strategically, the likelihood of intervention increases. That intervention might not look like a direct military invasion. It could come through support for opposition groups, economic destabilization, or intelligence operations designed to fracture the alliance. The Sahel's governments are betting that their unity, their Russian partnerships, and their popular support will be enough to deter or withstand those pressures. Whether that bet pays off depends on how far the West is willing to go to reclaim what it's losing. What happens next will determine whether this is a regional shift or a continental realignment. If the Sahel holds, if other African states continue to reassert control over their resources and security partnerships, the post-colonial order collapses in practice, not just rhetoric. If the alliance fractures under Western pressure, it becomes a case study in why challenging established powers is still too risky. But the fact that the challenge is even happening, that three of the poorest, most conflict-affected countries in the world are forcing France into economic anxiety, says something about where power is moving. And it's not back to Paris.